Welcome to Aquarian Diary, where we discuss issues around the emerging age of Aquarius. I'm your host, John Irving. Thank you for joining me. Hi guys, it's John here. It is December 12th, 2021. First of all, I want to thank very much my good friend Kerry Erickson, who is based in Vancouver, Canada. He created this wonderful intro music for me, and I really appreciate it. He and I have worked on a lot of creative projects on and off over many years. He's a fantastic artist and creator. He teaches painting and creates music, and he's just all around brilliantly creative person. Thank you for that, Kerry. I will include an unedited, uninterrupted version of this at the end of this segment for those who are interested in it. There is a lot to talk about. It was November 23rd, I think, when I last published something. In the interim, I have recorded many things which I just did not end up publishing because I was spending a lot of time reflecting on a whole bunch of things, and they didn't get fully sorted out in my head until recently, and there was also, I've been very busy. Now, one of the main things that happened was that somebody I have subscribed to and listened to for a very long time, who I generally held in quite high regard, came out with something saying that climate change was a naturally occurring phenomenon. Well, that really set me off because there's absolutely no empirical evidence to support that whatsoever. This person channels, so I was then forced to sort of question this person as a source and where that information is coming from. We know very definitively what is causing the climate change we are experiencing. We have been able to and can measure the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere very accurately, and we've done so for a very long time. The greenhouse gas phenomenon is a very fundamental basic science. You can reproduce the effect of it in a very basic science experiment that you can do in a high school lab. It's very easy to demonstrate how adding more CO2 to the atmosphere will increase temperatures, which then, of course, result in a lot of the climate disruption that we are currently experiencing. In fact, there's no subject that has been studied more in human history than climate change because of its dire implications for the planet, all of the species that exist here, humanity, civilization, and so forth. If all of the land ice, for example, was to melt, we would have over 220 feet of sea level rise. And on our current trajectory, that is a distinct possibility down the road, not in the near term, but for future generations to face. That would wipe out most major metropolitan cities on the planet. And there's no way to build walls that are over 200 feet high, practically. And then there was somebody else who came up with something, basically another channel who said that they supported Trump. And I was like, what is going on? Well, we have been suffering this plague of misinformation and disinformation now for a very long time. And it even extends into the spiritual community. I was speaking with somebody not too long ago and who was describing an issue that arose in a spiritual group where you had vaxxers versus anti-vaxxers. And it was the same kind of thing, where there are now these divisions occurring within this community. I mean, personally, I'm pro-vaccine. I think that if we just look at the numbers of people who are landing in ICUs right now, it's almost exclusively the unvaccinated. And of course, if we don't get a hold of this thing, it's possible that it could mutate into a strain that could take out vast numbers of human beings. So it just seems like common sense and decency and responsibility to do something about it. And then, don't get me started on conspiracy theories. I'm not a fan of conspiracy theories. Most of them can be discredited with even a very basic level of intellectual rigor. It's not complicated. Most of them are just completely nonsensical. Like, for example, that there's no way to inject microchips into people using this kind of syringes they're using to vaccinate people with. I mean, it's just completely nonsensical. Not to mention that our cell phones basically track everything we do, think, say, and where we go and where we shop. And, the whole premise is ridiculous. So this does raise the question of being discerning and discriminating. And obviously that's something that we really need to do. Now, what do we do in these cases? I take a pretty firm stand on this matter because of the consequences. If we look at the coronavirus or climate change, we are talking about this severely impacting hundreds of millions. Actually, pretty much, I think in the case of climate change, we can say every human being on the planet. So that's 7-8 billion people. In the case of coronavirus, we're talking about millions of people at risk. So these are very serious issues. And, how do we, members of the spiritual community, where do we draw the line? I'm not 100% sure about that, but this is going to segue into something else that I want to talk about. One of the things I recorded was kind of a deep dive into what I've just been talking about, and it ended up being very long, and I thought, oh, no one's actually going to want to listen to this. It's just, even though I can do it, get into the weeds of some of these issues technically, I'm capable of doing that. It just didn't seem appropriate or that it would be beneficial. And I spent a lot of time editing and re-editing and thinking about, these subjects. And I couldn't, it was too much effort on my part. And then I thought, well, what's really at stake here? What is really going on? I think that in reflecting on, what a lot of the stuff I have posted is basically saying that, reality is a complete mess, quote unquote reality. And that it's nonsensical and irrational. And a lot of this stuff is nonsensical and irrational. That's beyond question. Completely irrational. I also, was very critical, for example, of the situation with the United States and China. And in that regard, I want to offer a note of caution. If we do get into some kind of a conflict there, it might only just be on trade, then we are extremely dependent on a lot of goods that are produced in China now for all kinds of sectors of the economy, especially in the technology arena. So that could mean that a lot of the things that have been flowing through our economy and through the product chains could be disrupted. And that would mean that there would be potentially, if the situation escalates between, say, the United States and China. And I have been reading the press recently, and a lot of the stuff I said about what's going on with the United States and China is actually starting to occur. To me, China is a much bigger issue than Russia. I mean, other than the fact that they have a large nuclear arsenal. They do supply Europe with a lot of natural gas, which is problematic, and I've pointed that out before. I would not be reliant upon them for energy. That's another benefit of renewables, by the way, is that we will no longer be dependent on these other countries like Saudi Arabia and the Middle East and Russia for energy. That gives them a stranglehold over us in many ways. Separate subject. Nonetheless, back to my point, if there's certain consumer goods that people rely upon, I don't necessarily think you can count on them being, depending on how things work out, I don't think people can depend on them being readily available. So if there's certain electronics and things like that that you really need for, say, for example, for your income, you might want to keep that in mind, that there could be supply shortages in that area. Another thing is that with respect to climate change and the severe weather events, we just had, a few days ago, we had over a foot of snow, and then we had just last night, crazy winds and huge amounts of rain. All that snow is gone. And not only that, but we had a couple hours of thunder and lightning here in early to mid-December in Nova Scotia, Canada. In fact, the day it snowed, someone 2 hours from here, they got no snow. We had over a foot of snow, and 2 hours from here, they had none. This is like really weird. What that's doing is these severe weather events are also affecting the supply chain and therefore inflation. One of the reasons that food prices are going to go up and continue to go up, because this is a global problem that we can't completely control, we can expect to see much higher prices for many items that we have previously sort of taken for granted. So people have to bear that in mind too. This is kind of starting to get into sort of hunker down territory to minimize and be prepared for situations where there could be supply chain disruptions, or goods and services that we rely upon may not be readily available. So a lot of the stuff that we've taken for granted in the past, where we had a stable climate, we can't necessarily take for granted going forward. There's a couple other things on my sort of mental checklist that I want to mention. One is I discussed the USA Pluto return in a fairly recent episode, and I want to point out that there are a lot of top-tier professional astrologers. I'm talking about people who write the reference books that professional astrologers use, who use the USA Declaration of Independence chart for the United States. These are not amateurs. These are top-tier people like Robert Hand. I'll put a link down below to an episode of the Astrology Podcast, which goes into a great amount of detail about how the various charts for the U.S. were considered and which ones are generally considered to be the most accurate. Now, the Constitution chart has bearing, of course, as well, but I think if we just look empirically at what's happening to the United States right now, it's very evident that they are going through major changes. If it actually gets worse than what we're going through now and what is likely to occur in next year in 2022, then it's going to get really bad. It's possible that the Constitution chart might, and the Pluto return to that, might just alter the way the Constitution itself is structured. That is my own personal opinion. So that's one thing. Another is that when I talked about the United States and China, I was very critical of the United States. And I want to be clear. The reason I'm concerned about that is because I would very much rather have the U.S., despite all of its flaws and shortcomings, be more influential or dominant than, say, for example, China, because at least with the United States, we're talking about a democracy. So I'm criticizing the United States because I think it matters. I do not want a superpower to be a non-democratic country or an authoritarian country. This, to me, would be a horrific outcome for humanity. We do not want that. That also gets into the episode where I discussed why Spirit is intervening now. And I think it's because, and I'm getting strong chills here right now, very strong chills. This is really important. The reason that Spirit is intervening and engaging with us on an unprecedented level is because we are at this very important turning point in human history where we can go different ways. And that means that the future is not cast in stone. So Spirit is basically intervening to help us avoid potential negative outcomes. And I think, like I said in that episode where I discussed this is a very rare and significant occurrence. So that's something we have to bear in mind. The battle is not over, in other words. Wow, more chills. We have to fend off the dark side. And that is why holding people accountable for saying things that are just ridiculous, climate change denial or, vaccine denial or all that kind of stuff is that's why it matters. Another very, very important thing, and this is what all of this period of the last few weeks I've been reflecting on a lot of things. Another very, very important thing for us to consider. Now, I am not a fan of partisanship, tribalism, nationalism. I think all of those kinds of things, those energies, those paradigms are old paradigm stuff from the Piscean age. I don't actually care about any of that stuff, really. Never have. What matters is humanity as a whole and the earth as a whole. Like, really, there is no justification for the kind of poverty and disparity that we see on the planet. There's just simply none. It makes no logical sense, and it makes no spiritual sense. So those are things that we're going to have to deal with. I think, obviously, that's going to take a lot of time. I'll give an example of how partisanship can be so destructive. A number of years ago here in Canada, we had a whole movement called Canadians Against the Prorogation of Parliament. We had the Prime Minister at the time, Stephen Harper, who was a right-wing politician who was the Prime Minister. And he basically tried to pull something that really went beyond the bounds of what's normal in this country, which was to silence dissent, essentially. And within a fairly short amount of time back then, there was a group that formed on Facebook that had over 200,000 members. These were people who were very concerned about what was happening politically. They came from a variety of different political backgrounds and parties, and it was kind of an unprecedented thing. This was around the same time as Occupy Wall Street. Actually, I made a lot of friends because I was very involved in that and active in it. And a lot of friends that I still have today were as a result of that, and my involvement with that, which was really cool. But what happened was that over time, the dominant political parties in Canada on the center or center-left sort of took that over and then filtered out anything that they felt was too negative towards them. This is partisanship, where people will put their party affiliation, say, for example, above other ethical concerns. This is why I've never been partisan politically, because I will vote for whoever has the best policies. I don't really care what party they're associated with. Now, we have a multi-party system in Canada, so it's a bit different than the United States. But I would never be a blind partisan, ever. That's kind of tribalistic. That doesn't sit right with me at all. I will vote strategically, and I will vote according to my own standards and ethics. I see partisanship again and tribalism and nationalism outside of certain bounds. I see that as being a negative. As a result, what happened was that movement just kind of completely dissipated, unfortunately. So the greatest threat to the status quo is exactly what sort of occurred then. For those who can recall, these movements occurred around 2010, 2011. This was a stunning thing. And as far as I'm concerned, those kinds of grassroots movements are probably the greatest threat to the status quo that are possible. The status quo is business as usual. And if the status quo persists, in many ways, we're kind of doomed. So we have to break this cycle of disparity and injustice and social and human rights abuses. We have to break this paradigm, this pattern that we have been in for centuries, if not millennia. So for members of the spiritual community, this is really important because we have to always question whether we are just engaging in or with that paradigm. We can't expect, for example, people within that paradigm to break it. It has to occur from outside, and we have to shift the energy around these paradigms. We ourselves have to step outside of that paradigm, and then we can reflect back on it. But we have to be careful. Like, for example, I see a lot of people placing a lot of hope in certain political figures and so forth to make substantial changes to the system. I mean, for example, look at Bernie Sanders. He was kind of a revolutionary, a radical in a lot of ways, but he would have been someone I would have voted for. Now, the establishment in the DNC basically went out of their way to keep him at bay. I, in fact, recall during the campaigning for the Democratic Party, I stopped listening to MSNBC because they were so rabidly anti-Bernie that it was crazy. It was obvious that they had an agenda to keep people who wanted substantial reform and revolution out of the system. And this is exactly what happened with the Canadians Against the Prorogation of Parliament I've talked about, and with Occupy Wall Street. These movements were sort of shut down or repressed by the status quo because they are such a great threat. So, for example, those of us in the spiritual movement, if we really want to shift things forward, we kind of have to step out of or detach from this old, defunct, and corrupt paradigm that is destroying our biosphere, for example, and that perpetuates social injustice and so forth. Now, this is incredibly important. Strong chills here. Very strong chills. We can use our psychic and creative power as powerful beings to shift the paradigm here on Earth. We just have to make sure that we are not embedded and encased within it, because that itself is a trap. People who are promoting, for example, a materialistic paradigm are voting for the status quo. And the status quo is destroying civilization, quite literally. We could get into chemicals in the environment. We could get into, how many people are doing jobs and things that they despise just to survive. This is an injustice. This isn't right. That's not the way things are supposed to be. But until we ourselves question and step out of that paradigm, nothing will change. So if we want to disrupt the status quo or the current paradigm, we should literally step outside of it. That might, for example, mean not consuming crap and junk that we don't need. That might mean not engaging with civilization and society in a way that perpetuates the social and environmental and spiritual injustices that are occurring now. That is how we are going to shift things, and that's how things are going to change. We should be looking at everything we do and think, and in all of the ways that we act, and question, am I perpetuating this defunct, corrupt paradigm or not? What we're witnessing going on right now is like, there's many people who are sort of acting in this petulant, indignant, infantile way about what's happening in the world. Like a 4-year-old whose ice cream cone was taken away from them, stomping their feet because they want to go back to some kind of mythical past that never actually existed. Maybe it did if you were a white person with an upper middle class income living in the suburbs, but for everybody else, it sucked. Whether you're a woman or a person of color or an immigrant or whatever the case may be, that is not a paradigm that we want to promote. To me, this is like incredibly important. And really the crux of all of this is, are we so like, for example, a lot of people are still talking about celebrities, which I just find absurd. Like, I couldn't give a crap what, these people, like the Queen or the royal family, that is emblematic of the worst of a completely ridiculous paradigm. Why are we investing our psychic energy and attention in those kinds of things? Or billionaires or celebrities who produce like syrupy junk. I don't really get it. Don't get me wrong, like I said before, I love artists and creative people, but they tend not to be ones who entertain the masses, the bread and circuses and all that crap. So let's consider this. Again, I apologize for the weird background noise. The sump pump won't stop here because of the insane amount of rain we had. And I know other areas are experiencing unprecedented weather. This is symptomatic of climate change. That's just the beginning. I mean, it's going to go on for, at a minimum, decades, if not centuries. So we also have to be prepared for major disruptions in the way that we've been living and functioning as a society. I totally advocate taking dramatic measures right now to do everything we can to mitigate this. But even if we do that, it's going to be a long time before things return to a state of normalcy or what we would consider normalcy. So, fasten your seatbelts. But most importantly, let's stop endorsing and promoting a ridiculous, nonsensical, and inhumane paradigm. I guess what I'm saying is that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. One other important thing, which is this question of whether, for example, I or we are promoting fear. I am not advocating fear. I am definitely advocating concern. We should be very concerned and we should be engaged. This stuff is really important and it really matters. And like I said, that's why Spirit is intervening, because they're trying to help us fend off negative, if not potentially catastrophic outcomes. Now, that means that we need to be engaged, and complacency is not an option. I don't, for example, really understand people who say, I'm not interested in politics, it doesn't matter. Well, if Trump had been reelected in the United States, the U.S. right now would be going down a path of outright fascism, which would have dire repercussions for hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. So it absolutely matters that we be engaged. So for example, I will be concerned probably for the rest of my life about the state of the world. My level of fear will be diminished when I know that something is being done about it. that we are doing the very best that we can to head off. Strong chills here too. When we are doing the very best we can to deal with these issues like adults and not be in denial or alternate realities or outmoded paradigms. So we have to be aware, we have to be engaged, we have to be active. And that might even mean literally disengaging. It might be a state of action that is beneficial. And I would love to talk to people about that. But you see where I'm going with this. We can't just pretend that what's happening isn't happening, because that is the worst thing that we can possibly do. Because if we're not engaged, we could go off the deep end. So we have to be aware and conscious and doing something about it, even if it's on a spiritual level. We can meditate and pray and visualize and engage with others. Ooh, strong energy here. Engage with others to set our intentions for the kind of world that we want everyone to experience. And this is the Aquarian age, which is that this is us as a collective using our conscious will and intent to shape reality rather than being victims of it. Let us shape and create a much better world than the one that we have been inhabiting for everybody, especially the young people, and especially for those who aren't as privileged as us. I'll leave it at that. Thank you. I'll talk to you again soon. And again, thanks again to Kerry Erickson for the fantastic intro music. I'll end with that so that you can hear what he beautifully created for me.